David W. Berner is a journalist, broadcaster, teacher, author of 4 memoirs and 2 novels. Of a well-respected man, the San Francisco Review of Books says, impressive writing with enormous sense of humanity. His broadcast reporting and documentaries air on WBBM, the CBS Radio Network, and on NPR. David is a former writer-in-residence at the Hemingway Birthplace in Oak Park and the Jack Kerouac Project in Orlando. His writing appears in Ionia Review, Under the Gum Tree, Peregrine, Tiny Lights Journal, and others. A Well-Respected Man, or October Song, is available for $12 tonight. Welcome, David.
So apparently I'm the prose among the poets, right? I love listening to poets. I did an MFA program many years ago, and the poets were the ones who were hanging outside the building smoking. They had some deep things that were going on, and I always loved to be hanging around them. I want to say a few things about, this book was just launched last night at the Chicago. Thank you very much. At the one of the greatest independent bookstores in the city of Chicago is the Bookseller in Lincoln Square, if you're familiar with it. And I was pleased to be able to work with them again. So this is brand new stuff, and it's been in the works for a number of years off and on. Memoir was published prior to this coming out. And my background, as you heard, is as a journalist, so I've always done things that are real, right? Myself and journalism, depending on how you feel about journalism. But this is fake, so it was fiction. So it was a little different for me, although I've written another piece of fiction, but it was based a lot on what I had experienced. So this has some autobiography in it, but it's not really factual. But I need to give you a little bit of a tiny bit of a background before I read this section, because it's from the 3rd chapter. Martin Gregory is a protagonist in this story, and he's a professor from Chicago who falls in love with a student, and there's a breakup and it's difficult, and he's reprimanded, and there's some other issues, and he decides to leave and ends up in the Cotswolds in England to sort of rebalance his life. And he is there, and while he's there, well, prior to that, he had written a book called Fire and Wine, and that book became a kind of a cult book among women. Women loved it. They would come to his door, they would stop him in the parking lot, and they would tell him how much he had written about their lives. And at first, of course, that was wonderful for him, and then it became old. It became much like groupies, and he started to shun it. So when he went to England, he thought he had escaped that. But one morning, a woman comes to his door, knocks on the door, and says, "You've written about my life." And he shuns her, rather brusquely. And he decides the next morning, after a lot of whiskey that night and listening to Beethoven and Ode to Joy very loud in his flat, he realizes he probably treated her poorly. But he teaches at the local academy at the area in the Cotswolds, the high school academy. So he decides to stop off at a place that he knows in the morning before he heads to the academy. And this is what this is about. There was a small bakery on the walk from Martin's flat to the academy, and sometimes in the morning he would stop for tea. Pie in the Sky on the corner of Church Lane and Albert Street was best known for its apple tarts, but the breakfast scones and muffins were unsung gems. And the place had good hot tea, brewed and steeped in individual pots. Milk and sugar, Martin requested. This was the way his English grandmother had made him tea when he was a little boy. In the last few years of her life, his grandmother had lived with Martin and his parents in a brick bungalow on Chicago's northwest side. For years, he was a coffee drinker, but when he moved to Banbury, tea would oftentimes be the drink of choice, especially when he'd run out of coffee in his kitchen and was tired of reusing the grounds. "1 or 2, the woman at the counter would ask. Each time he visited the bakery, the same gray-haired, awkwardly pleasant woman would ask that question. Martin thought by now she would have remembered how he took his tea, but wondered if maybe she just liked asking. "1, please," Martin replied. Martin sat at one of the two oval tables near the window and sipped his tea from his cup. He was behind on critiquing stories his students had written, but had no desire to work on that now. Martin wanted just to sit, to stare out to the street, to watch the morning begin. There was still plenty of time before the first bell would ring, and he had no desire to rush. Martin had been working on slowly downsizing his life's pace. His Chicago existence was far different from what he had now in Banbury, and although he loved the change and certainly needed it, he was not yet quite used to it. Sometimes he had to consciously consider taking his time, forcing himself to appreciate the moment, letting life be and not always be compelled to take some kind of action. That's what he did when he lived in Chicago. He never allowed himself time. There was the book and the publicity around it, then teaching and advising students. Martin was also involved in the Chicago Literary Association, conducting weekly workshops and speaking at events. When Amelia, this is the woman, the student he fell in love with, came into his life, they'd go to dinner and the theater and attend poetry readings and spend nights listening to live music at the Empty Bottle, a gritty bar on the northwest side of Chicago. Also, Amelia had school and a full load of classes, and a lot of energy was spent trying to keep the relationship quiet. It was work. Banbury offered a different reality. Not only was there no longer a woman in his world, but his duties at the academy were far less rigorous than at the university, and Martin felt no need to be involved with other organizations outside the school. It had been an important factor for maintaining tenure when he was at Elmhurst, but at the academy, it wasn't necessary. He was getting better at living more deliberately, but there were times when Martin's head would race and spin, and he had to put in a careful, calculated effort to keep a quiet mind. The morning was cloudy but no rain, and the bakery's large window to the street offered a clear view of one of the village's busier corners, although busy was a relative term in Banbury. A smartly dressed older woman pushed a small cart near the grocery, the only other shop open early on a weekday. Two boys in navy blue jackets and three girls in plaid skirts moved along a pedestrian crossing at the far corner, each carrying a backpack that was far too heavy to maintain proper posture. And a police officer stood in front of the newsstand smoking a cigarette, talking to the proprietor and laughing. Martin thought of the Beatles' Penny Lane. He took in the scene, sighed, and swallowed the tea. He had not slept so well the previous night. Too much whiskey, too much ode to joy, too many thoughts. "Another tea, sir?" the woman at the bakery asked. Martin politely shook his head and smiled. He tasted the last of the tea, wiped an index finger across the bottom of the cup to catch the damp sugar left behind, and stood to adjust his jacket and throw his messenger bag over his shoulder. With his back to the bakery's entrance, he heard the chime of the door's overhead bell. "Excuse me," Martin said. He did not notice the woman now standing just inside the door. "Good morning, Mr. Gregory," the woman said shyly. Martin was halfway out the door when he turned toward the voice. Oh, good morning," he replied. "I didn't see you there, and whilst, how are you?" It was the woman who had stood in the rain outside his flat the day before. "I'm sorry for yesterday," the woman said. "I shouldn't have come to your home without being invited." No, it's all right," Martin said. I was rude. Forgive me. You just caught me at a bad time." "I wasn't my best," Martin continued. The woman smiled nervously and looked away. "Maybe I can make something up to you," Martin asked this question without thinking, really. It was instinctive, unplanned. Just as he had said it, he wanted to take it back. The woman tilted her head in anticipation of an explanation. "Maybe sometime you could tell me what's really on your mind," Martin asked, surprising himself with that question. A wary smile came to the woman's face. "It's really important that I talk to you, Mr. Gregory." Martin set his bag on the table and rummaged for a pen. "This is my office phone number," he said, writing on a page that he had torn from his journal. "Call me when it's convenient." The woman accepted the paper. "I will do that, Mr. Gregory," she said, almost inaudibly, "but I don't know if you're willing to be accepting of what I really have to say." For a moment, Martin stood motionless. He noticed the woman's hair. It appeared softer than he'd remembered, delicate waves now attracting the muted light inside the bakery. He noticed her eyes, unusually blue, and he noticed the umbrella, the yellow one she had held open the day before outside his flat, the one she now carried closed and close to her side. Martin nodded, smiled, and turned from the door to the street corner. It was only after he reached the academy's entranceway just minutes before the first class bell that he'd realized he'd forgotten to ask her name. Thank you.